In this episode of the Untitled podcast that you're about to listen to, Jesse and I will not be talking about what Kanye West might have said or might have done. And in lieu of that, we'd like for you to think about how women are oppressed in Iran and the Iranian people are protesting. It is not in our news, but they are protesting and they are giving up their lives for a better world. Anytime you see something about Kanye West or any other celebrity that might be doing something or not doing something, please remember, folks are dying for their freedoms. All right, so it seems like we're just going to have to talk this one through.
Yeah, I think so.
And in the pre-show, you made a comment to me about Kanye needs to be silenced, and in honor of that, we will not talk about Kanye.
Good.
Whatever the hell his name is.
Yeah, we won't talk about it. We will mention the thought process that kind of spurred from something related to that individual is basically labeling anti-Semitism as hate. I mean, hate is hate. It's hateful. It's intentionally an attack on an individual or a group. And so not mincing words being the impetus for the discussion. But it's more than that. It's a recognition that we categorize things all the time and we label things all the time. And there's a question that I posed that is kind of what we are trying to figure out how to explain and convey, which is words in general are labels, and how they're used typically is in a way to relay information and make it understood, or how they should be used. And I was saying that I felt like there were two categories there of labels, and it was somewhat difficult to come up with exactly what I thought those categories would be.
Yeah, I came from, I was just, had been thinking about it, and just, I think that the productive way of using labels is a way to help us. It's like words, and that, well, they are words, but we use words to convey our thoughts and ideas because we aren't telepathic, and most people can't. Most of us are not intuitive enough to use other forms of communication. Sometimes, some other forms of communication do work, and it makes me think of the whole I thing that women do. I don't know if you know about this I thing, but I almost never get it. Anyway, that could be something we talk about later, but probably not. But like the idea of we use our words to convey our thoughts and ideas, and it's really important to be more, communication is more important than correctness. And it's kind of like labels we take a specific word to carry a lot of meaning or definition, or just a way to, I guess, it's using specific words as a form of shorthand for conveying certain ideas and thoughts.
And to tack onto that, there's an added sense of over-attachment to labels for a perceived meaning instead of trying to understand the actual idea trying to be conveyed.
I think when we step away from, or when we, when labels are productive and they help us to communicate better, that's a good thing, and that's what we that's what we want to use labels for. I think, well, I don't want to say I know what the intended purpose of labels, because I don't think there's an intended purpose, but I think what comes up in spoken word, or in written communication, spoken word, is that we think about who our audience is, mostly, Sometimes we don't think about it, but we try to use these labels to not have to, for brevity. And, like we talked about, I can't remember if it was last show or the show before, we talked about, sometimes people will see the R label next to a politician, or the D label next to a politician, and be like, bad. They don't even look at the platform. They just look at that one single letter label and what it represents. And they automatically determine that person is, I'm against that person. Like I'm against that person. Like that person is bad. I don't agree with their values, when they don't actually know what their values are.
And I know this has been a recurring theme in many of our conversations as well, but let's maybe provide a baseline of what, in general, the theory behind labels provides for human interaction as well. And according to sociological theory, labels are used to associate known behaviors, or really used to identify something similar to a known behavior, so that you can lump it into a category internally based on your experiences. For example, flames, like fire, right? Fire's bad, fire's painful. You have an instant recognition of fire being dangerous. And so using something to illustrate that a surface is hot, such as a flame or something to that nature, gives you a context to understand the potential danger of what that presents. And so that's the idea behind labels in general, and how they are used to navigate the world and understand contexts without necessarily having a basis of understanding. The problem, as we've talked about it before, comes from believing a label to have a definitive context where it does not have a definitive context. So back to your example, a political party affiliation does not convey specifics about an individual, where the symbol of fire conveys very specific aspects about a surface or an environment, or whatever context it's used with. And this is where we kind of get into where I was struggling to identify how I would convey the difference between those labels that are maybe misapplied because they're taken as being deterministic, against those labels that do convey something that's fairly deterministic about what is labeled. And I don't really know how I would separate those yet, either, even as I kind of talk about and illustrate it fairly, I think, appropriately.
Yeah. I was giving you a little bit of a hard time earlier about categories being a type of label, and that's why we got to talk it out. Also, your fire label made me think of a funny meme I saw. It's a picture of a hand dryer, in a public restroom, the air hand dryer, and it showed a picture of pushing the button, and there were wavy red lines that showed like heat would, to an illustration, a simple illustration to show that heat would come out, or hot air was going to blow from the device. And somebody posted, yes, push button and receive bacon. And I was like, we all know it's not bacon, but I love that. Because once it's been, once somebody said push button and receive bacon, I was like, now all I can think of is that it looks like bacon.
Yeah, I think I've seen that one. If not, I've at least heard it referenced.
Yeah, it's a good one.
And so around this topic as well, one of the things that I kind of mentioned, and I will link to an article that Dan Rather wrote that kind of prompted some of this overall as well. But the lead on the article kind of stopped me because it was both 100% correct, but it also prompted some of this other thoughts about how we apply labels. And the lead was that hate is hate, and it's that simple. Which 100%, I could not agree more with that statement. It got me to thinking about a couple of other questions surrounding that, though. One being, what other things could we be that definitive about? Because, my initial thought was, well, if the opposite is, if hate is hate, then love is love. But would we actually say that, or would we find ways to subdivide it and qualify it because there are different types of love as we view them? Well, there are different types of hate as we view them as well, but those are still hate. So as a category, right, I would say they would be equivalent. Love is love, hate is hate. But that's where the follow-up question that I put in our notes kind of came from is, would you put quantifiers around it? Are we being overly simplistic by saying hate is hate? Or in general, would it be considered overly simplistic? Or is it still accurate and just that there can be varying shades of how bad that hate is?
There definitely are. But I think that when Dan Rather's article, when he wrote "Hate is Hate," I think it's, I interpret that to be, you have a binary situation here, and that you have hate and you have non-hate, and it doesn't matter. It's qualitative. There's no amount of quantity required here or in this particular scenario. And I think in a scenario where we don't, of things that we do not tolerate, like, if you have a zero tolerance for racism or, that sort of prejudice, then, I don't think you need to quantify how much hate is there. Because I think that's where it makes sense that hate is hate, and when you don't tolerate something, you label it as like, this is hateful, and we're done. Whereas, starting to quantify it might be like, well, we can allow a certain amount of hate.
Yeah, so I completely agree. My thought process with the question was more along the lines of, if you have someone who grew up without exposure to other ways of describing someone who is different from them, and they didn't know that those words were hurtful or offensive, and when they were finally corrected, immediately felt remorse and changed the way they described people, that would typically be something that we would look at more as naivete, maybe to an extent, but certainly for that individual, the purpose was not to be demeaning or hateful. The purpose was to be to reference another group in the same way that they knew that group to be referenced, and that was it. Now, granted, in today's societies, it's kind of difficult to claim that case. I'm not trying to make a case for that existing in a fairly ubiquitous manner. I'm only using it to illustrate this idea of what I had in mind, which is for a one-off case of someone truly not knowing, and as soon as someone mentions it, they're more than happy to change their method of communication. Would you still consider that hate, or would you consider it just a lack of awareness and knowledge?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think, hate comes from, I think hate comes from a place of knowing. Like, here's where, I feel like, there are those that have come before us that have kind of, in a way, tackled a similar topic. So I think about, made me think about the movie American History X. I don't know have you seen it?
Yes.
I watched it pretty recently because I don't remember why, but I mentioned it and I realized that it's been quite a long time since I'd watched it. It might have been actually, I might only ever watched it once until I rewatched it recently. And if that is the case, then I watched it in 2001 for the first time. I actually watched American History X and American Beauty in the same night. I had a theme going on. depressing movies with the word American in them. Anyway, American History X really, I think it holds up quite well. Knowing that a lot of the story is based on actual people and events that things that did. So it's not it's not a biopic. It's not a biography of any sort. But the concepts and the ideas and the things that are portrayed are based on things that actually happen. So knowing that, I think the movie holds up really well. And I think about how, like, the main character, Edward Norton's character, I don't recall his name, like, he was, in a way, you could say that he was naive about certain things, but he knew enough to be truly hateful. Like, we can just say that how he was hate. That is, that is, hate is hate. Can be applied to him and his actions. Through the course of the movie, things happen to him, and that hate goes away. Spoiler alert. So,
I can certainly agree with that.
I think it's one of those things where it's like, if you want to be generous and assume positive intent, you can say, hey, you're being hateful. Or those actions are hateful, or those things that you're saying are hateful. And, and this sort of hate is not something that we tolerate. I mean, at that point, that's, a line in the sand, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that is very easy to see the demarcation point for, which is kind of strange for most behaviors. But, if someone is confronted with some interpretation or idea, and their intent, whether forcefully or just continued maybe outside of the realm of that particular person interaction-wise, and it's very clear to see when someone disregards being confronted by a behavior or by communication choices or whatever form it entails. And so continuing to engage in the same behaviors or communicate in the same fashion, whatever it is, like any level of continuation after that point it moves out of the realm of not knowing to choosing not to care or choosing to ignore someone else's input because of disagreement with what they were saying. But at that point, it's no longer from a place of not knowing.
Right. Or even, maybe you knew it beforehand and you just weren't confronted with it because the culture that you grew up in, the microculture that you grew up in was accepting of that. And it kind of made me think of like when we talked about, does saying something racist make you a racist? And we sort of landed on kind of, yeah, but it's really when you're confronted by somebody who says you're making a racist comment, you're making a prejudiced comment, and you maintain that position and don't reevaluate your position on that thing. That's what really, that definitively makes you a racist. And, you're a racist until you reevaluate your position. And I think it's kind of the same thing. It's like, hey, you said a hateful thing. You're being a hateful person right now. And when you don't reevaluate your position, then it's like, well, okay, you're a hateful person. And it's not until you reevaluate that position that, we would agree that you're not a hateful person.
And just to clarify, it takes more than just reevaluating the position, right? Because you could reevaluate your position and then continue to do the same thing because in your reevaluation, you decided you were doing the right thing to begin with.
Right. Changing your position, reevaluating your position, changing your position, actively not doing those things, doing the opposite, doing the opposite of those things, doing loving things, doing accepting things.
I kind of feel like I want to reframe part of that to go back to this idea about each day trying to be a better version of who you are. Because that's really the point of what this comes from, is that you're confronted with something. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. But most people are going to have to kind of think about something. It's not going to be an immediate change most of the time. In some instances, sure. Some people are more willing to accept criticism than others, especially in the moment. But let's just say that there's a relatively short delay for the sake of this particular point of exploration. The idea would be more akin to being confronted with it, being taken aback, having some sort of emotional response, whether it's defiance and whether it's escalation, maybe it's just quiet solitude and thinking it through. Regardless of what it is, it's still an emotional response. And then after thinking about it a little bit further, making an effort the next day to do better based on that input. Well, that's the equivalent of what we've talked about a number of times about trying to be a better person on an ongoing basis, being able to grow and be just better in general, right? And what better means can be somewhat subjective, sure, but the idea is that if you're consistently moving in a direction that is more supportive of others and more empathetic toward others, that's kind of the trajectory you want to be on. But the part of why I wanted to bring that into it as well is because we do tend to make these general claims about an immediate change, or when confronted, a person become immediately remorseful. And the reality is that that's not the general way most people respond in the moment. Some will. But most people, especially if it's something where there was a genuine lack of knowledge beforehand, they're going to be somewhat stunned if they've never been confronted by it in the past, and take a little bit of time to process it. It's just the way we're wired. So within that frame of thought, maybe immediate is a little bit too quick, but certainly within 24 hours, a noticeable change in, and I don't want to get bogged down into qualifying it either, but it would be a short time frame.
We're obsessed with it.
Yeah, it would be a short time frame, certainly within a day, before it would transition from a point of not knowing to a willful choice. That's kind of what I'm wanting to just clarify a bit.
I don't know. I think sometimes it's immediate.
And I agree. Sometimes it is, but it's just thinking about behavior. People
have a process to go through.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, are you allowed to go through your process for your entire life? Well, kind of, yeah, you are allowed to do that, but we're gonna put labels on you like you're a racist if that process takes your whole life to not be a racist. Yeah, we're gonna do that, and so even if it's the experience and the process of being a human requires a certain amount of leeway, I guess you could say, but people are going to label you good or bad. The labeling being good or bad, not you being good or bad. But yeah, they're going to label you good or bad, and the labeling process being good or bad immediately based on your reactions. And depending on what kind of relationship you have with that person that's doing the labeling or whatever it might be, you may never have a chance to be unlabeled by that person. So there's a lot of, as simple as I think this is, there's a lot of nuance. It's always what we say when it's actually not simple.
Yeah. Well, I knew it wasn't as simple as we would like for it to be anyway. But one of the things that I find interesting as a way to summarize that, because I think it illustrates the point well, is that at the point of confrontation, continuing to either engage in the same type of communication style, or maybe not necessarily show remorse. Yeah, regardless of what it is.
Publicly.
Right. In that moment. Outwardly. Yeah, in that moment, yes, you're going to be viewed negatively by whoever it is that finds it offensive. I think the interesting piece, and the piece that is missing from what we've described so far, and I think helps illustrate why I was struggling with the immediacy, is we also tend to be fairly forgiving if remorse is shown quick enough, because we acknowledge there's a process. So if within the next day there's an effort to reach out and say, I've had time to think about it. I'm sorry for whatever it was. There's a much greater willingness to accept that than there is going a week later and then trying to climb back out of it. Because as time passes from that point of confrontation, the idea of it being intentional further grows and cements within the people on the other side of that. And so you can have a point of no return when it comes to your reputation with those people.
Yeah. It's interesting because I was thinking about immediately if it takes you a week or if it takes you 24 hours or it takes you a week or a year or however long it takes for that process to occur. In the interim, you're going to be labeled a certain way. You say a hateful thing, and if you don't immediately change your position on your own, or when somebody says, hey, that was hateful, I'm probably going to think of you as being hateful in this way until you change your position, and no matter how long that process takes. So there is some immediacy to it. But yeah, like you said, a day later you come back and say, oh, that was hateful and I don't like that and I don't want to be that way. Yeah, that's really easy to accept. But I think even like if it took a whole year and that person was continued to say hateful things for the next 364 days, and then, on the 365th day, they, they reanalyze their position and they change position on that thing that we were deeming as hateful, then it's like, oh, I accept that. Now it's like, we'll still probably think, oh, well, you were confronted, a year ago about this and you wasted 364 days being the same way about it. That doesn't feel good, but it just made me think of like, as whenever we try to take something complex, because almost all things are complex, and reduce them into something that is simple and talk about it simply, we then just say, oh, well, this is also nuanced. And I think that's what that means. It's like we're trying to talk about this simply, but it's actually not simple.
Welcome to humanity is probably the best response to that one, right?
Thank you. Thank you. I have...
along the same lines, I think on the receiving end, you could make it an easy case of saying, if someone were to come back, a day later and apologize and acknowledge things, it's fairly easy to say with some immediacy, thank you, I appreciate it, let's move on. Whereas if someone were to come by, a year later, you could be skeptical and still view them the same way for a prolonged period of time after that, until repetitive behaviors created this idea in your mind that maybe they had changed.
It's the whole thing about walking the walk versus talking the talk. And the longer that you go, the more damage is done.
Right. The piece that is interesting between those two, everything that we're describing is still labeled. It's as far as the confrontation or the point of confrontation, we have labeled that the kind of demarcation point for the purpose of exploring the conversation. But the way we think of the elapsed time tends to also be categorized, does it not? And the same thing with the time after that, where you're showing this turn of heart. We don't consciously label them as much as we use different phrases to describe that concept, such as walking the walk, or illustrating a level of remorse. We have these phrases that we use to label that period in a way that's fairly vague because of how subjective that period is. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's until somebody is lying on their deathbed. It's still the same concept. And so if we go back to kind of the original struggle of how would you label that concept to be able to convey it to someone in a way that makes sense, it would be very different from the initial point of confrontation where you say, hey, that's hateful, because it's a lot easier to describe hate as hate. Felt like a lot of meandering.
It did, but I don't even know where to go from here.
Well, I think that illustrates the point, right?
Yeah.
Because there are these labels that we are fairly immediately able to latch on to and understand. And then there are labels that are abstract, that we have a lot of difficulty being able to convey and wrap ideas around in order to convey. And that's what I'm struggling with classifying. What would you call those two types of labels? And I don't have an answer for it at this point, even though we've talked about it for however long.
We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.